New opportunities everywhere just waiting for the open-minded. Sarah's Country shines a light on the matters that matter most. And here's your host, Sarah Perriam.
Kia ora and welcome to Sarah's Country, where we choose to embrace the challenges that lay before us. This is to balance the business of producing food and fashion that is sensitive to people, profit, and of course the environment. But it's not always as easy as it seems, is it? Especially when our consumers have perceptions around the production systems that vary around the globe and of course their expectations they want us to meet. Now in Sarah's Country's new Opinion Maker show, which is every Tuesday, we bring you the debate and thought-provoking ideas from our guests of industry experts, leaders and thinkers that will set the scene around one particular topic, and then we will break that issue down with our esteemed panel. Now, our panel discussion this week is based around Richard Rennie's article in this week's Farmers Weekly. That's about how New Zealand's $68 million a year Japanese honey export market is being threatened by their strict glyphosate levels. And this is traces of it in our honey, which has one honey producer in the Farmers Weekly article describes as almost impossible to meet. So, to kick off, in 1972, a world revolution was formed here in New Zealand, a first for the health, food and medicinal industry. It is the first solid honey lozenge, known as honey Droplet, as formulated for its fast absorption and, of course, we know honey's properties when it comes to our immunity. We will be joined to kick off and talk about this with someone who knows a thing or two about the Japanese market and why their consumers are demanding traces of glyphosate that could be 10 times lower than that in the European market. Raymond, the CEO of Honey Droplet, will set the scene for us around the consumer perceptions. And we will follow on with a University of Canterbury genetics professor, Jack Heinemann. And I've actually seen Jack speak around his presentation around his science work of glyphosate's connection to antibiotic resistance in humans. And so therefore he also has done some study into this particular issue around traces of glyphosate in New Zealand honey and the effects of it not only on humans but also the environment. And of course on our panel we will have two industry experts in this field. John Rawcliffe is the CEO of Unique Manuka Factor, and Karin, CEO of Apiculture New Zealand, representing the beekeepers of New Zealand. And so therefore, we want to break down and hear from the panel, is this a consumer perception that's gone too far in terms of glyphosate's risk, or is it something that New Zealand needs to sit up and pay attention to because it, of course, is threatening one of our valuable export markets into Japan? So to start off very shortly, we will be joined by Raymond, the CEO of Honey Droplet, to set the scene around the Japanese market.
This is Sarah's Country, produced in alliance with Farmers Weekly, the place New Zealand farmers turn to for a trusted source of in-depth agricultural journalism. Stay connected to the matters that matter most by subscribing to My Daily Digest at farmersweekly.co.nz.
Really pleased we got into this. Thanks for your help, Dave.
It's a good idea, honey. You reckon it'll come out? Cover it in talcum powder, leave it 10 minutes, you'll be fine. Good call, Dave.
Good call on getting those security cameras, Dave.
You call a new one yet?
Yeah, kind of.
When you've got decisions to make, we'll be there to help you make the right call.
I'd go for those ones, Bob. Yeah, good call.
Did you choose these?
Oh, you know.
For great advice and insurance, talk to FMG.
Well, New Zealand's $68 million a year Japanese honey export market is being threatened by glyphosate limits, which one honey producer describes as being almost impossible to meet. After detection of low levels of glyphosate in some New Zealand honey, Japan has threatened to halt future shipments if samples detect 5% or more of imports with glyphosate that exceed their country's limits. Now, the Japanese limit for glyphosate glyphosate residue is 0.01 per kilogram, which is 10 parts per billion, 1/10 of New Zealand's standard of 0.1 milligram per kilogram, which is 100 parts per billion. Of course, consumer perception certainly overrules a lot of things when it comes to our export markets. And so to kick us off in the opinion maker panel around Japan putting pressure on our New Zealand honey producers is CEO for Honey Droplet, Raymond Neal, who joins us now. Raymond, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share with us your experience in the Japanese honey market. Would you be able to set the scene for us and around your time in Japan and your learnings on the way that they have very conscious around food security and safety?
Well, thank you for having me today. So my history in Japan goes back to 1988. So I've been there approximately 33 years now. So I have multiple businesses in Japan. Most of them are food related, and one in particular is honey. So I'm the CEO of Honey Droplet and also Honey Japan. So predominantly we're a honey producing business, importing New Zealand honeys. So that's the base of me in Japan doing business there. When it comes to the topic that we're talking about today, about glyphosate being in honey, you're absolutely right. Their limits are very, very low compared to anywhere in the world. We normally consider the EU to be one of the most strictest. As you pointed out, it's 0.05% of glyphosate allowed in honey, where Japan is 0.01. So it is absolutely dramatically lower. And because of that, I can see that New Zealand is very concerned because of the very low limits. But can I just point out one thing it's probably important to bring it up earlier than later. It's not a New Zealand problem. It's a worldwide problem. All honey exported to Japan must meet those requirements. And one more thing that I wish I could maybe bring up earlier than later is that New Zealand prohibits all honey from around the world. So New Zealand prohibits all import of honey. So you do not see any international honey on the shelf, ever. You only see New Zealand honey. Where in our situation, we're able to export to Japan. And again, it is not a New Zealand problem, it's a worldwide problem. So all honey that you find on shelves in Japan, they all meet those regulations.
It's an interesting situation, Raymond, because there's very few food products whereby we ban imports of others and only stock our own in particular. So, yeah, I'll have to follow that up with the panel because it's a very interesting point. Is the current New Zealand standard quite standard worldwide?
The New Zealand standard, sorry, your question meaning, sorry?
Of glyphosate limits, do you believe? I mean, as New Zealand, where do we sit on the levels of other honey imported countries going into Japan around these particular limits? And do you believe that New Zealand's limit is fair in that?
Well, that's a really interesting thing. I mean, really, what does fair mean? And, you know, the actual question is, I hear a lot of people talking about the reality is, if we just get to the chase, glyphosate. What is glyphosate? It's predominantly in Roundup. There's a lot of people commenting perhaps it's related to cancers, related to illnesses, and that really is the concern that we're talking about. And I think a lot of people are very worried and concerned about the percentage of these types of chemicals in our foods. And so again, we must follow the rules and regulations of every country. So just unfortunately, it's just a little bit more difficult for us to export into Japan because of their low requirements, their high requirements. So I think that's really where it sits.
Yeah, and can you talk us through the process when you're producing the honey droplets, lozenges, the testing process that you go through, and the accreditation to the export market that you've met those criteria?
Wonderful, great question. I really wish a lot of other people would ask these questions to find out what actually other industry players are actually doing in the industry. So I have this opportunity now. So I really must say thank you. For our company, Honey Droplet and Honey Japan, we receive honey. We have also, when we receive the honey, it's totally certified, meaning all the criteria must be met. So, for example, if we're sending to Japan, we must follow all their regulations. So that's prior to making the product. Once the product is formed into a lozenge, we send it for testing again to confirm that it's correct. Once we send it to Japan, and this is quite a big difference for us. In Japan, Japanese market is a very sensitive market, and you must be in there long term, absolutely not short term. It takes a long time to do business there. Once you create trust, you have incredible customers for the long term. So for our company, once our product gets to Japan, on the shore of Japan, we send it for retesting. And that's done in Japan, and those test results are given to our customers to confirm that we abide by all rules and regulations and that it's safe for the customer.
Is glyphosate free a label claim that the Japanese honey products will have across them, do you believe?
Glyphosate free? Again, is that possible? Obviously, it's possible. Realistically, it would damage our market. It seems to be, by all the news reports, test results that you'll find, that there are a lot of products that have glyphosate, or residue at least. So to be glyphosate free, I would hope so, but it's a tall order.
Does it create reputational damage for your products, Raymond, when these types of news articles are circulating about residue traces in New Zealand honey in general?
The answer is absolutely yes, but that's more fear and concern. But that's our duty to resolve that problem, and we have done that. So as soon as that was reported in Japan, instantly our main distributors, for example, department stores, they wanted product off the shelf until we could prove that we were meeting the rules and regulations, which we did within a week.
When it comes to sourcing your New Zealand honey that you put in the droplets lozenge, what restrictions do you have in place, and a sort of farm assurance program from your suppliers around their production systems, and how do they differ from a majority?
Yes, another great question, but really, again, getting to the chase, regardless of what a supplier will tell us or show us regarding, for example, certification test results, regardless of that, we will always retest.
Yeah, so there's nothing that specifically stands out that they make a claim that they have done their way of obviously spraying out and replanting Manuka, and of course harvesting in a unique way that's any different.
Well, we do listen to our suppliers, and we love their stories, and we have very, very long relationships. But we tell all of our suppliers straight and very directly, whatever you will send to us, whatever all the test results and whatever you claim, we will retest. And if it's not true to label, then they will no longer be our supplier.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Serious Country's Opinion Maker panel, and the theme is around Japan putting pressure on our New Zealand honey producers. That is the CEO for Honey Droplets, Raymond Neal. And we're going to continue very shortly following on with Professor Jack Heinemann from the University of Canterbury, who specialises in genetics but has done a lot of research in traces of glyphosate and the flow-on effect, particularly on antibiotic resistance science, but he has done a lot of work as well in this particular field, and why there is elements that science can back this up as well. So that'll be coming up very shortly here in Sarah's Country, before at the end joined by a panel with Karin from Apiculture New Zealand and John Rawcliffe from the unique Manuka factor.
This is Sarah's Country. Catch the latest on the matters that matter most wherever you are. Listen to Sarah's Country on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple or Google Podcasts. Try asking Alexa or Siri. Play Sarah's Country on podcast.
Every morning, Kiwi farmers wake up to produce higher quality food. Yet, every night, some Kiwi families are going to sleep hungry. Meet the Need is a charity founded by farmers, and it's here to change all that. We're about New Zealand farmers feeding New Zealand families by donating a small part of what we grow when we can. You can help us make sure no one in New Zealand goes to sleep hungry again. Visit meettheneed.org and follow us on social.
One of the first things you learn when you live out here
is where to shop for the things you need to live out here.
like electric fencing,
Or horse feed.
or bee suits.
Children.
Chook food.
Do you want a couple of these?
Or something stylish to wear. Not everyone's got stuff like this.
But at Farmlands we do, and then some.
So if you need anything to help your farm,
Grow, milk, dredge,
Rhea, come on in.
because we're out here too.
Well, back in 2017, research from the University of Canterbury confirmed that the active ingredients in the commonly used herbicides Roundup, Camber and 2,4-D that contain glyphosate alone can cause antibiotic resistance at concentrations that are well below application rates. The University of Canterbury's molecular biology and genetics professor Jack Heinemann joins us now here on Sarah's Country as we break down around Japan's pressure on New Zealand's honey producers. Welcome to the show, Jack.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I have watched one of your presentations in a live format recently on this particular topic, and we do know that glyphosate is used in New Zealand's production systems sporadically, and it does vary differently to other parts of the world. We do need to make a little bit of a statement around that.
Yes, it is, and it's only one of a number of different herbicides and other kinds of pesticides that are used. In the U.S., for example, Roundup or glyphosate-based herbicides will be used throughout the summer season because they have genetically modified crop plants that tolerate the use of that herbicide. And in New Zealand, we don't. However, you can use these types of herbicides as burn-off herbicides anytime during the season on paddocks. And there's no stand-down period for, grazing your livestock on those paddocks immediately after use. But again, it's only just one of many different herbicides that are available. And it's not just used by farmers, it's also used in cities.
Absolutely. And the context of today's discussion is honey producers. Could you explain around how glyphosate is used in the production system of sort of the conversion from a traditional sheep and beef property, maybe into a Manuka farm utilised for harvesting honey?
Well, I'm not an expert in those agricultural practices, but it is common to use such general herbicides if you are changing your production system. And Roundup is famous, for example, in Argentina for converting the pampas as well as Amazonian forest into soy plantations. So use it as a burn-off herbicide, you kill everything that's there, and then you replant. And because that kind of herbicide affects the roots, it has a long-lasting effect on the kinds of plants that you're trying to remove. And then you can reestablish your new crop plant. And it may be what people do in establishing or changing to something like a Manuka plantation.
And when it comes to Japan's limits being 10 times that of our MPI standards of the milligrams of residual traces of glyphosate in our honey, where do you believe that has been set by recommendations of science? And do you believe our standard is fair, or should we be dramatically changing this to meet markets that are demanding it, such as Japan?
I think obviously you'd want to meet your market expectations. Japan's regulators are sovereign and independent. I mean, we respect Australia's decision to not let us come visit anymore because we have possibly a COVID case in Northland, and we have to respect Japan's decisions on its own food safety standards. But we're changing topics a little bit, because what we're talking about here is a food safety standard that's being implemented by a food safety regulator on the Japan side, versus also the environmental impacts of these herbicides, which are the ones that will be experienced by the bees themselves, or by agricultural workers or homeowners who are using these herbicides. Japan is using a science-based system, just like our country and other countries that have a robust regulatory system. They've set their standards for what they believe is appropriate. Remember that it's when you're looking at food safety, it's a combination of the ingredients you're worried about, but also the likely exposure to those. So it'll also be influenced in their case by patterns of use. How much Japanese people or different ethnic communities within Japan may use honey, so how much they're exposed to it, or other products that could carry these residues and therefore have a combined exposure. And that may be very different than for New Zealand.
Let's talk about the research that the University of Canterbury and yourself have been a part of, and how the connection to antibiotic resistance occurs.
That was for us, in a way, a surprise. The chemicals that we find in herbicides are not related to the chemical structure of what we use as various kinds of antibiotics. When we started to test the possibility of a linkage, it was based on the idea that there was one root molecule in one of the herbicides that had a passing resemblance to aspirin. And in the 1980s, that aspirin moiety had been shown to cause antibiotic resistance in potential human pathogens. So we tested whether the herbicide in question could also cause this effect. And it did. And it did so at very high levels. We then tested other kinds of herbicides that are chemically unrelated, and we found that they all cause this effect to one degree or another, although it's in an antibiotic and a species-specific way. Also then, what we did was isolate the active ingredients, so like glyphosate, dicamba, 2,4-D are the active ingredients of those herbicides, and tested them in a purified fashion. They caused the effect. And we isolated what are different adjuvants in these herbicides, or what could be adjuvants in these herbicides, which are often called surfactants when they're in a herbicide. We found that the surfactants also cause the effect. So all the ingredients of these herbicides, when bacteria are exposed to them, cause the bacteria to change their response to our antibiotics. Interestingly for us, those surfactants I was talking about in the herbicide are what we call emulsifiers in food. So the very same chemical compounds that you might find in a herbicide as a surfactant, you'll also find in your mayonnaise and your ice cream. So we're getting direct dietary exposures. When you get them through food, they're regulated. The concentration of them is regulated. When they're used in a herbicide, the concentration is not regulated and it's not monitored. Only the active ingredients are monitored as residue limits. So we don't know how much we're being exposed to these other kinds of adjuvants through the food chain.
To make the connection to the effect on human health, would we not need to consume huge levels of food with residue traces of so small amounts?
Fortunately, our studies with the bacteria are still laboratory studies. And fortunately, most of the concentrations that we see causing this effect are below what countries set as their maximum residue limits in food. So as a human health concern, I think we have some protection. But we have to remember that our only exposure isn't the maximum residue limit of a herbicide in the food. Like I say, you may have some herbicide residue in your food, but you're also eating a sandwich with mayonnaise, which will have even more surfactant in it. And the food, the quantity that you're allowed to have in food is enough to cause antibiotic resistance. So in our hands, we're very close to these daily exposures that might start causing the human microbiota to change in their response to antibiotics. But I think probably for humans, the worst kind of exposure we could get, or the most consistent, is probably in our home environment, where we're using herbicides around the house, or our neighbors are, and our pets are walking through their lawns and gardens, and then coming into the house with application rate exposures on their fur. That's probably the more important exposure in the urban environment. And in the agricultural environment, the more important exposures will be spray drift or the exposure of livestock to spray.
We just spoke to Raymond Neal, the CEO of Honey Droplets, and he explained the rigorous testing from the honey that they receive before they put into lozenge form, then tested here in New Zealand, and then again in Japan. What is involved scientifically in being able to test food of all makeup prior to us exporting, so therefore we can continue to build on the New Zealand brand around our very low traces of glyphosate in all our food products?
Food testing is a complex science, and every matrix has to have customized procedures for it. So it is difficult to test final products in a thorough way and also not destroy the product in the process of testing. So it's easier usually to test the ingredient input into the manufacture of that product. So if you're going to use, say, honey in the production of something like a lozenge, I think you said, you'd probably test that honey in its pure form as it comes into the system, rather than just test all sorts of different products like the lozenge as it exits. That's at least how I'm familiar with it. There also are probably companies who do, depending on what size they are and what their products are, test at some degree their output products, because we don't want these kind of surprises when it comes back from an international export market. That's reputation damaging, right? But what we should, I think, be aware of is that if we're detecting things like glyphosate in products like honey, then we probably have more exposures in the environment than we have appreciated. So it's not just a question of whether that amount of glyphosate in our honey is or isn't safe to eat. The question is, how much glyphosate are we using out there that we are able to detect it in our honey? And then what other exposures are there that may be even larger than we're expecting from food?
And I do want to talk to you about this because I understand that the label application rates on the back of a lot of our ag chem in New Zealand hasn't been modified to particularly New Zealand's production standards or way of farming because the ag chem companies are global companies, and New Zealand, even Australia, is too small a market for them to redefine the back of the labels.
That's very interesting. I didn't know this, but I guess it doesn't completely surprise me that they have set these. And most of the maximum residue limits testing is done in test samples and test fields, and then a little margin of error for how long before harvest you can apply is used. And as you say, these become label recommendations that aren't, as you say, then customized to how New Zealand does its agriculture and its weather and et cetera. So these are important places where we may get leakage into our exports, and that can cause us some trouble.
There seems to be a production system-wide issue when it comes to agricultural spray drift. So therefore, everybody is on the same boat effectively, because you've got from a vineyard that's next door to a sheep and beef property that's next door to a Manuka property. So everybody collectively should have a flow-on effect for this. Would that be possible to bring in a New Zealand standard?
I think it would very, very well be possible. I mean, it could be costly, but it's certainly possible. I think when we're talking about products, we talk about spray drift, at least there is some guidance about when to spray, and there are products added to herbicides to help reduce the amount of drift. It's not perfect, but there's an attempt to reduce that amount of unintended exposure. But when it comes to things like honey, you have pollinators who are actively working on in that ecosystem. And no matter how much you control spray drift, the spray is intended to land on plants. It's intended to stick to plants. So though there's guidance to not spray when, say, or try not to spray when honeybees are active, New Zealand has a lot of other kinds of pollinators, many of them native species. These pollinators have evolved a special relationship with New Zealand native plants. These pollinators we don't know nearly as much about as we do the imported honeybee. We don't know when they're active. We don't know that when we avoid spraying at one time to protect the honeybee and the honey, that we aren't spraying these other kinds of pollinators, insect pollinators, who are being doused then in the herbicide or working on plant nectar and pollen that is carrying herbicide. So it's a very complex ecological problem, and honey, in a sense, is a sentinel for us. It's a canary in the coal mine of just how much we become addicted to this chemical-based agriculture.
Fascinating. I learned about the leafcutter bee and the importance of that in the garden this week, and it sounds like a good bee because it doesn't sting you.
Yeah, I think it is a good bee.
Jack, I could talk to you for another hour on this and the evolution of all things that you're working on, a molecular biology and genetics professor at University of Canterbury, Jack Heinemann, joining us there on the discussion around Japan's pressure on New Zealand's honey producers as they expect the residue limits of glyphosate in New Zealand's honey to be 10 times less than what our current Ministry for Primary Industry standards are. Now, to close the show, we've got on our panel, our opinion maker panel, John Rawcliffe from Unique Manuka Factor and Karin from Apiculture New Zealand to break down the challenges that they face in representing their honey producers around New Zealand, and how we're going to be able to collectively work together with other industries, land-based industries, to achieve something which is of threat to our export markets.
This is Sarah's Country. Join the conversation. Have thoughts on an interview? Or have you got questions you want answered by a future guest? Let us know. Email sarah@sarahscountry.com.
The recipe for perfect beef and lamb. Take one small fresh country. Make sure it's nice and remote. Now, keep it at the ideal temperature all year round. Next, mix in the farmers. They go perfectly with the nature of this unique place. Add regular sprinkles of rain to really bring out the lush meadow grass. Then let your animals happily graze on this grass all day, every day. And there you have it, New Zealand, the perfect recipe for beef and lamb. pure nature.
Well, one of the highlights of the new format of Sarah's Country's Opinion Maker Show, which is every Tuesday, is that we round off our last guest's comments with a panel of industry experts and leaders that are across the organisations in terms of implementing or making changes to some of the issues that are arisen from the articles and opinions in Farmers Weekly. And on the theme of Japan putting pressure on New Zealand's honey producers, saying that they will halt import of New Zealand's honey unless it meets its strict guidelines of glyphosate traces, is something that we need to see how realistic this is, because one honey producer suggests that it is near impossible. So we're joined now by CEO of Apiculture New Zealand, Karin, and CEO for Unique Manuka Factor, John Rawcliffe. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Karin, I'll start with you. When one honey producer says it's near impossible, is that representative of all beekeepers in New Zealand?
Look, I think what he is or she is saying is that it's near impossible because glyphosate and the spray of glyphosate is an issue across the primary sector. So, you know, we're known as landless farmers, beekeepers, and so we're very dependent on the arrangements and the communications that we have with whether it's farmers, councils, regional councils, just in terms of spraying programs. So while it's very difficult, companies are able to test for glyphosate, and they have done for some time, and they are able to manage the limits, and Japan's limits are pretty strong, but they were very clear on their expectations of us quite early on the piece. So it's difficult, no denying it, and it's not a problem that beekeepers can solve alone. It is absolutely a national conversation that we have to have and actually have started.
John, from the Unique Manuka Factor, which was very cleverly created, highlighting that a high UMF in honey commands serious value, and of course medicinal benefits to human health, it would be, of course, vital to ensure that there's no glyphosate use specifically on farms that farm Manuka for honey, saying from outside influences, taking that out of account. Can you assure us that there is no glyphosate specifically used on those farms?
No, I can't, and I don't think anyone could. But what I can say is that from the Manuka side of the story, there is an assurance that everyone is testing and meeting the requirements of the Japanese government. So that's the bottom line. That's what they've said, and that's what we will do.
Karin, is there ways that New Zealand beekeepers can do things differently on farms that they specifically are in control of to limit glyphosate use?
So I think the first thing is we've been encouraging all our beekeepers to have those conversations with their landowners. That's the first thing. Find out when spray programs are in place. Do landowners need to spray? Make sure they are aware of some of the precautions that they can take, like not spraying around the hives, not spraying when the bees are out foraging. There are some things that we can do, but we also obviously just urge them to keep those communications open. But I do think we do need to have that national conversation now, just in terms of stories that I've heard from beekeepers about spraying programs that are going on, and that perhaps it's very timely to look at what else do we need to do. So we talked to regional councils and local councils. We worked with federated farmers last year, but I actually think this is something we're going to take to the government too, to just say, look, that conversation needs to happen at a national level.
Fantastic. And John, when it comes to the Japan levels, are you seeing any signs of murmurs in other export markets for Manuka that they could also be dropping their limits?
I cannot speak on specifically on the honey front, but I do know that the EU are working on legislation and working on this issue for all products. So I agree with Karin that too, highlighted there, but it's a national issue, and this issue needs to be done between government and industry and worked on. I don't think we can hide our head in the sands. I think we need to be proactive. I did the comment the other day that John Key says, well, being 100% pure is aspirational. I think we need to turn aspirational into reality and have those conversations, not massively in public, but as industry and government, to say, what do we need to do? How do we look ahead with these issues? Then it coming up and biting us. So I think we need to be slightly more proactive. And I think the work that's been done by APNZ over the last few years on this matter has been proactive.
Yeah. I mean, Karin, the thing is, if we take glyphosate out of the production system in New Zealand, the alternative isn't pretty either in terms of how we go about it. And there's so many flow-on effects of how to implement this into the system that would be things that I'm sure that you've uncovered in talking with other industry bodies pan-sector.
Look, absolutely. And I think what we're advocating, Sarah, is actually we're not advocating a complete ban of glyphosate. What we're saying is, actually, do we need to have a look at the way we approach pesticide and herbicide use? What are the conversations that we need to have with the farmers, with the landowners? And also, we need to understand a little bit more about what actually is going on in New Zealand. I talk regularly to scientists on this subject as well, and we don't know how much pesticide, how much herbicide sprays, are being used. We really would appreciate some good data on this, because I think data can help inform that debate as well, and where we need to go and where we need to head.
Yeah, it's an interesting one too. A lot of different agendas at play as well, and we always need to take into account to anything that is connected to change. John, I'm really interested in the product testing that Raymond outlined, and at what point in the development of the UMF did this particular criteria come into the form of accreditation to get such considerable value for the food?
We've had an international program of linking with labs overseas to ensure the testing regimes around UMF. There's two aspects to it: is what is UMF, and then obviously the regulatory compliance. So we've had a program over a large number of years to actually make sure we're in line with overseas testing, senior reference laboratories, that we are testing to their standards, and that we all have this level of alignment. So it's been part of our work over the last, it's been about 8, 9, 10 years actually.
And so therefore, is it possible, do you believe, to roll out, John, into New Zealand's other food products easily?
I can say this is a requirement of an overseas customer in Japan for honey, and that so for any other product that's way outside my scope. And I agree, I think with Karin, that there needs to be those conversations overall. So we're proactive on that overseas countries are not putting in legislation that we have good knowledge to help us with those discussions, that we're proactive on this, not in a reactive way.
Yeah, certainly. Karin, what does... I asked Raymond, Neil, around reputational damage for his product when there's news stories like this hit the Japanese market. And he said, yes, it is of genuine concern to him when he goes to a lot of effort for his particular product to meet these criterias. I mean, how much do all the stories that hit the global media have that flow-on effect, and have you got any examples of how?
So look, obviously it does have an impact on our reputation. We've got honey that's produced from this clean green country, and to have traces of glyphosate in it, well, obviously it's going to have an impact. I think the key thing for us is how we manage the messaging, and also just being really clear that these countries have glyphosate residue tests and residue expectations in place. We absolutely, as John said, we need to be proactive and we need to manage that and meet those expectations. But I do think we still have a really good story to tell about New Zealand honey, and this is one issue that has come up. We will absolutely manage it as well as we can, but we need to be really upfront with what we're doing about this to resolve this issue, and to ensure, I guess, that our consumers continue to have confidence in buying New Zealand honey.
Yeah.
can add a little bit about the Japanese market. There's a lot of what we describe as B2B from Japan to New Zealand, and that is the Japanese business people coming to New Zealand. They have a 10, 12 shops, a distributor. They visit the New Zealand beekeepers. They visit New Zealand. They have a one-on-one relationship with those individuals. They're selling the New Zealand story. So the impact of this is quite deep, and those relationships are special. They're selling what we talk about. It's about the cultural connections. So this, for me, and understanding some of those business-to-business relationships is quite important that we do get it right.
I want to end on a summary from both of you around some optimism. I mean, the New Zealand story for honey was released last year. And I mean, of course, with COVID ramping up worldwide, globally, immunity-based medicinal food products will be continuously in hot demand. How are you both feeling about the year ahead, Karin?
I am always optimistic about this fantastic industry, Sarah. I think honey, New Zealand honey, is a fantastic product. And look, we punch above our weight on the international scene, and people love our honey products. So like any primary sector, yes, we have our issues and we have to solve those, but we know that New Zealand honey has been in strong demand over the COVID period, and I don't think that will change, but we do have to be aware of what comes up and deal with it.
John?
Yeah, I mean, we have probably the most unique honey in the world, the Manuka story. It's got over 2,000 unique markers over and above any other honey from New Zealand. It's got that story of our land and our people. We're putting all our to people know through the rating system that it's got a lot of values, potential bioactives, and across the board. So what surprises me, and I've spent a couple of days talking about a chemical residue, yet I should be talking about the most valuable honey in the world with the most unique properties, with the greatest story ever could be told behind it. And for me, that's quite sad.
Yeah, and here's hoping that the year ahead sees the continuation of this conversation, Karin and John, and if I've got anything to do with it, I'm more happy to be on board, because this is a wider New Zealand food story that we need to continue to move in a particular direction, because market access is everything to New Zealand and is everything to the New Zealand economy, particularly in a recovery. Thank you so much to both of you for taking the time to join us on this week's Sarah's Country Opinion Makers show, where we've highlighted Richard Rennie's article about Japan's pressure on our honey products. I hope you have enjoyed learning more in depth around the articles that you take in from Farmers Weekly, and of course get a fuller picture around the issues and the matters that matter most to farming, food and fashion here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And of course we'll be back tomorrow, Wednesday's show, a Changemaker special featuring fantastic innovative solutions that will take our food and fibre production systems on into the future to meet our consumer demands. In the meantime, ka kite anō.